The most feared man in 3 territories couldn't make one woman flinch. Nash had put down more men than he cared to count, and every one of them had been afraid of him because he had built his whole name on that fear. The woman standing in the cabin doorway wasn't afraid, and the silk on her shoulders had no business being this far from anywhere. By sundown, he knew 2 things: that someone was coming to kill her, and that he was going to stay. Stay until the end to see what he did that day, and if it moves you, hit that like button and drop a comment with your city so I can see how far this story travels. Nash had been riding for 3 days without sleep, and the blood on his sleeve had dried to the color of old rust. The bullet was still in his left arm, lodged against the muscle where a rail camp foreman had put it after a disagreement over a card debt that turned into a killing. The foreman was dead now, so were 2 of his crew. The warrant that followed had been signed in Cheyenne and copied to every telegraph office between there and the Idaho line, and the price on the print was high enough to bring men the way a wounded animal brings wolves. He rode with the Colt 1873 on his hip and the Winchester lever rifle in the saddle scabbard, both fed from the same belt of Calder E4 to 40 cartridges, so one hand could reload the other, the way a man who had done this too long set his tack, every piece answerable to the next. The bay was failing, its breath coming in long shuddering pulls that said another ridge might be the last, and he didn't blame it because he had asked too much of it the way he asked too much of everything that ever carried him. The country had turned rough and empty south of the Snake, broken ground where the trails gave out, and the maps stopped bothering. And that was the point. He wanted to be where no one had a reason to look, far enough from the rail towns that a badge meant nothing and a name meant less. He turned the bay into a cut between 2 ridges that no road had ever touched, following the sound of water, because water was the one thing he couldn't do without for another hour. The canyon narrowed until the walls pressed close and the sky thinned to a strip of white between the rocks, and then it opened, without warning, into a valley the size of a man's patience, a flat grass pocket cupped between the hills with a creek running through the middle of it. He would have ridden past the entrance 100 times and never seen it, and that was what made him slow the horse and look twice. There was a cabin at the far edge of the creek, low and square and built of timber squared by hand, with smoke rising from the chimney in a thin gray thread, and a garden beside the door in straight weeded rows, turnips and beans and something green he couldn't name. A buckboard sat under a lean-to with no team hitched to it, the bed empty and swept clean. Nash stopped the bay at the mouth of the canyon and sat there for a long time, his good hand resting on the Winchester where it lay across the saddle. He had expected water and a place to lie still long enough to stop the bleeding, not smoke or a garden or any sign that someone had chosen to live this far from the reach of the law. Whoever was inside that cabin was hiding from something too, and the thought should have made him turn around, because a second hiding place in the same valley is just a second set of eyes that might sell him for the price on the paper, and he had ridden away from easier shelters for less reason. But the arm was turning cold below the elbow, and the horse was done, and the creek was right there. He told himself it was only water and a night's rest, while his hand stayed on the rifle and his eyes stayed on the door. He rode down into the valley with the sun at his back, the shadow of horse and rider stretching long across the grass toward the cabin like a finger pointing the way. The door opened before he reached the creek, and a woman stepped out into the last of the light. She was small and still, and she didn't move as he came. Nash had seen 100 doorways empty at the sight of him, women pulling children back, men reaching for guns they didn't have time to draw, and he watched for it the way a man watches whether he knows is coming. He waited for the flinch. It didn't come. She stood in the doorway with one hand resting on the frame and the other hidden in the fold of a coat too heavy for the season, and she looked at him the way a person looks at something they have already decided about. There was no fear in it, not even surprise, the kind of calm that only comes from having already accepted the worst possible outcome and having no more use for anything softer. Nash stopped the bay 10 yards from the door. His hand had gone to the Colt without him telling it to, an old habit that lived in the fingers and didn't ask permission. He let it rest there. The woman's dark eyes tracked the movement, noted it, and dismissed it in the same breath, and that told him more about her than anything she could have said. He had killed men who were less steady than this. "Your arm," she said. Her voice was low and unhurried, and her English was careful, each word set down like a stone in a path. "You are losing blood." It wasn't a greeting. It wasn't a question. It was an observation made by someone who had seen wounds before and didn't find them interesting anymore. Nash looked at the drying stain on his sleeve and then back at her, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, he didn't know what kind of room he had just walked into. He dismounted slow, keeping the good hand where she could see it, and let the bay drink from the creek while he walked toward the door. The woman didn't step back to let him in. She stepped sideways, just enough to clear the frame, and the movement told him she had done this before, made space for a stranger without ever giving up the ground she stood on. The cabin was one room, and it was clean in a way that frontier cabins never were. The floor had been swept down to bare wood, and a wood stove sat against the far wall with a kettle on it and a low fire underneath. A table held a lacquered box, the color of dark honey, polished until it caught the stove light and threw it back, and beside it a folded cloth and a row of small glass bottles he didn't recognize. Against the back wall, half in shadow, leaned a long shape wrapped in cloth that was clearly not a rifle, the outline too curved, the balance wrong for any gun he had ever held, and she wore silk. Not a scrap of it, a whole garment, a kimono of deep blue beneath the dust-coated trail coat, the kind of work that took months and a loom and a country he had only ever seen on a printed page. It was out of place the way a diamond is out of place in a coal scuttle, too fine for the rough timber and the smell of wood smoke and the mud on the threshold, and its presence in this room asked a question nothing in the cabin could answer. Nash had expected a hermit or a squatter, some man or some ruined family scratching a life out of the wrong end of a territory. He had not expected this. He stood inside the door with his hands still near the Colt and his weight on his good leg, and he took the room in the way he took every room, exits first, then hands, then eyes. Her hands were the problem. One rested on the table near the lacquered box. The other he couldn't see. "You can sit," she said, and she nodded at a chair beside the stove. It wasn't an invitation, it was a diagnosis. She had looked at the arm and the way he held it and decided he wouldn't stay standing much longer, and she was right, and the fact that she was right annoyed him in a way he couldn't afford. He sat. The chair held him, and the stove heat found the cold arm and made it ache worse for a moment before it eased. She moved to the table and opened the lacquered box, and he watched her hands, both of them now, as she laid out a row of needles so fine they caught no light at all, each one set in a groove of dark velvet. The needles were wrong, too. They belonged in the same impossible country as the silk, and he had never seen a frontier woman with tools like these, and his face must have changed because she glanced at him and almost smiled. "My grandmother used these," she said, and that was all she said, and she let the rest of it sit in the silence between them. She didn't explain the country or the grandmother or the box. She let him watch and decide what it meant, and a man's face learns faster than a lecture teaches. His hand had gone to the revolver again out of habit when she first reached toward him, and she had watched it the way a person watches weather. She didn't flinch. She didn't ask him to move it. She simply waited until the hand settled on its own, and then she took his arm and turned it to the light, and her fingers found the wound the way a good tracker finds a trail, by touch and by the lay of the muscle underneath. "You won't die from this tonight," she said, "but you'll die from it by the week's end if it closes wrong." The words hung in the cabin like the smoke from the stove, and he heard in them the flat certainty of someone who had buried a person from a wound, just like this one. She wasn't guessing. She wasn't warning him. For his sake, she was stating a fact the way she had stated the first one, flat and final, and he understood that the woman kneeling by his chair with the needles had seen more of death than most men he had ridden with. The cabin held its breath around them, the fire settling, the light from the single kerosene lantern on the shelf throwing an amber flicker across the silk and the steel and the strain-wrapped shape against the wall. He had come looking for water and a night's stillness. He had found a woman who wasn't afraid of him in a room full of things that shouldn't have been there, and the question of who she was had grown louder than every bounty on his name. She worked the way a man sets a trap, slow and patient and without wasted motion. The needles went in along the arm in lines he couldn't follow, and at first there was only the small bright sting of each one, and then a warmth that started at the wound and spread outward until the whole arm felt heavy and loose, the pain draining out of it the way water leaves a low field when you cut the bank. He had expected hurt, he had not expected relief, and the relief unsettled him more than the pain had. He watched her face while she worked. It was the same face she had worn in the doorway, all sharp angles and high cheekbones and dark eyes that didn't ask anything of him, and there was no performance in it. She was simply doing the thing she knew how to do and letting him witness it, and that was a kind of pride he recognized from men who were good with horses or guns, the quiet kind that never needs to announce itself. When the last needle was in, she bound the arm with the strip of cloth she tore from a clean fold, and she poured something from one of the small bottles across the wound that bit like a yellow jacket and then went cold. She didn't ask if it hurt. She had already told him he wouldn't die tonight, and asking would have been a kind of lying. "There is food," she said, and she crossed to the stove and ladled something from a pot into a bowl and set it on the table beside the lacquered box. It was a broth with greens in it and a knot of dough, and it smelled like nothing he had eaten in a year of trail cooking and hardtack. He ate where she pointed, and he ate the way she ate, careful and unhurried, the way a person eats who has gone hungry long enough to know that rushing a meal is the same as wasting it. She saw it in him. He saw her see it. Neither of them said anything about it because in the country they both came from, hunger isn't a thing you confess, it's a thing you survive, and the recognition between two survivors isn't spoken so much as shown in the way you hold the bowl and the way you don't look up until it's empty. "You have been alone here a while," he said. It wasn't a question, because a question would have given her the choice to lie, and a statement gave her the choice to say nothing, which was the kinder door. "Long enough," she said. She didn't look at him when she said it. She was rinsing the bowl, her back to him, and the short answer and the turn back told him that long enough was a number she didn't want to count out loud. He leaned back in the chair and let the warm arm rest across his thigh, and for a little while the cabin was only the sound of the fire, and the creak outside, and the small domestic noises of a woman putting her kitchen right. It was the quietest he had been in a year, and the danger of it wasn't lost on him, because quiet is where a man drops his guard, and a dropped guard is where a man dies, and he had to keep reminding himself that the woman across the room owed him nothing and might be the thing that killed him yet. The wound will kill you slower than the men following you. That was what she had said, or close to it, and the way she said it made clear she had dug a grave for someone who thought a wound like this was a small thing. He looked at the lacquered box and the row of bottles and the careful swept floor, and he understood that this cabin wasn't a home, but a place where a woman had come to die slowly and had been doing it well, and his riding in had changed the arithmetic of that without asking her leave. She set a second bowl of broth in front of him without a word, and outside, the last light went out of the valley and the stars came on hard and white over the ridges. Somewhere south of the Snake, men with a paper that had his name on it were making camp, and somewhere else, in a direction he couldn't guess, other men were riding toward this same valley for a reason that had nothing to do with him. He didn't know that yet. He only knew the broth was warm and the arm had stopped bleeding, and the woman across the table was the first person in longer than he could name who had done him a kindness without wanting something back for it. That was the most dangerous thing he had found in this valley, and he knew it, and he stayed anyway. He found it in the morning, the way a man finds trouble, by looking where he was told not to look. She had slipped against the back wall with the wrap shape beside her, and when she stepped out to the creek at first light, he crossed the room and put his hand on the cloth. It was heavier than he expected, and the weight sat wrong, too much of it toward one end. He pulled the cloth back an inch and saw steel, a curved single-edged blade mounted on a long wooden shaft with a round guard where the blade met the wood and a sheath of lacquered wood over the edge, the blade held to the shaft by a single wooden peg, small as a match, and the whole thing built to come apart and go back together in a man's hands. He had never seen a weapon like it, and he knew, the way a man who has lived by weapons knows, that it hadn't been made to hang on a wall. She was in the doorway when he turned around, and she didn't look surprised, and she didn't look angry. She looked like a woman who had been waiting for him to do exactly this, and had already decided what came next. "That is a naginata," she said. She said the word the way she said everything, careful and set down, and she let it stand alone. She crossed the room and took it from where it leaned, and the cloth fell away, and the blade came out of the sheath with a sound like a long, slow breath. And she held the whole length of it across her body, with a hand on the shaft and a hand near the guard. It was the moment the room reorganized itself. He had been reading her as a widow or a lost wife, some woman who had been left or ruined and had crawled out here to vanish a little at a time. He had been wrong. The naginata in her hands wasn't the property of a woman who had given up. It was the property of a woman who had been taught to fight before she was taught to cook, and who had brought the thing across an ocean because she expected to need it. "My father's house was in the north of Japan," she said, and her voice didn't change. "My father is dead. My mother is dead. My brothers are dead. Men were sent after the last of us, and the last of us is standing in this doorway." She didn't use the word princess. She didn't name the house or the rank or the country that had ordered the killing. She let the blade and the silk and the lacquered box do that work, and he understood her the only way he could. Through the frame he already carried a warrant, a price. Men who wouldn't stop until the line of a family was finished. He didn't need the word for it because he had been living inside the same word for 10 years. The parallel landed between them without either one naming it, and it changed the air in the cabin the way a change of wind changes the air before a storm. Two people who had both learned what it cost to stand alone against something larger than themselves, looking at each other across a table that held a medicine box and a bowl of broth and the small ordinary wreckage of two lives that had run out of road. Her hunters weren't his hunters. The men coming for him rode out of Cheyenne for a card debt and a killing, and the men coming for her had crossed water for a house and a name. Two separate roads heading for the same valley, and the territory wasn't big enough to hide from both. There was one more thing, and he found it when he looked in the corner. She had slept against a sack of rice, not much left, the bottles on the table, fewer than he had thought, some nearly empty. A stack of dry wood by the stove that wouldn't last the week. She had been rationing for one, for a woman who expected to die here alone, and his riding in hadn't been a rescue, but a second mouth on a countdown that was already running, with a number on it smaller than either of them wanted to say. She followed his eyes to the rice sack and the low wood pile, and she said nothing, because in the country she came from a shortage shown as heavier than a shortage spoken, and that wasn't what he had expected. He had expected her to explain, or to ask, or to bargain for her life with what she had left. She did none of it. She simply let him see the truth of the place, the way she had let him see the naginata, and waited for him to decide what he was going to do with it. He didn't decide that morning. He only knew, sitting in the chair with his arm wrapped and the broth still warm in his stomach, that the woman across the room wasn't a stranger anymore in the way that mattered. She was a second set of tracks on the same trail, heading for the same narrow pass, and the only question left was which set of hunters reached the pass first. Dawn came up gray and slow, and the bay was rested enough to carry him out of the valley, if he asked it to. The trail back through the canyon was open, the creek was low enough to cross, and south of the Snake, the country would take him if he moved now and didn't stop. One more ridge and the bounty line broke, and he would be a man without a price, for the first time in 10 years. He had the map of it in his head. He had been running that map for 3 days. He stood at the corral with his hand on the saddle and the horse saddled and the Winchester in the scabbard, and he ran the choices the way a man runs cards before he lays them down. He could ride out and let her die, and no jury in 3 territories would blame him, because he owed her nothing, and the territory understood that a man looks after his own skin first. He could ride out and leave her a warning, a few words about the men on her trail, and call it enough, and ride away telling himself he had done the only thing a stranger could do. Or he could stay. He could stay and make himself a target again for a woman he had known for one night and one morning in a cabin with a week of wood and a sack of rice and a door that faced the only way in. He could throw away the ridge that would have made him free and stand in a stranger's doorway with the same iron that had put the warrant on his name, and wait for the men who were coming for her with nothing between them and her but him. 3 paths, and the pause before he took one is the point, because the choice a man makes is only worth the weight of the choices he didn't make. Nash looked at the saddle. He looked at the canyon mouth. He looked at the door where the woman stood watching him with the naginata leaned against the frame behind her, and he didn't say a word. He walked the bay back into the corral and unsaddled it and turned it loose to graze, and the sound of the girth hitting the fence post was the whole decision. There was no speech. There was no oath. There was a man putting a horse away because he wasn't leaving, and the woman in the doorway understood it the moment the post rang, because in the code she carried, a thing shown is heavier than a thing spoken, and he had not expected her to understand it that clean. He had not expected that. He had expected confusion or gratitude or the small, clumsy relief of a woman who had been alone too long. He got none of it. She only nodded once, a small motion that cost her nothing, and she stepped back inside and left the door open behind her, and the open door was an answer in the same language as the unhitched girth. The cost of it found him before the morning was out. He had been almost free, 1 ridge from the paper, losing his name, and the men out of Cheyenne, riding home empty, and the price going cold, the decade he had spent as a wanted man, ending on a hill above the Snake with nobody to tell. That was the life he had just set down for a woman whose full name he didn't yet know, in a valley no map could find, against 2 sets of riders who wouldn't stop. He spent the morning making the cabin ready, because ready was the only answer to dread that a man like him knew. He walked the single approach and found the two places a man on foot would have to come, and the one place a man on horseback couldn't, and he set the Winchester where it could cover the open ground, and the Colt where it could cover the door. She watched him work without comment, and once she brought him water, and once she laid out the needles and the bottles on the table again, and he understood that she was making the cabin ready in her own way with the tools she had for the same fight. By noon the place had been changed. It was no longer a home and no longer a refuge. It was a door with two people behind it, and a single way in, and the knowledge that the first set of riders to reach the canyon wouldn't be the last. He looked at the naginata, leaning beside the Winchester against the wall. Two weapons from two countries, and he didn't say what he was thinking, and neither did she, and the silence between them was the first thing either of them had trusted in a long time. They came at midday on the second day, the way trouble always comes. Later than you fear, and sooner than you hope. Nash saw them first, 4 riders on the southern ridge, sitting the skyline in a row with the sun behind them, so he couldn't read the faces, but he could read the tack and the long guns across the saddles. He knew the look. He had ridden in a shape just like that one on the other end of it more times than he was proud of. He counted them through the Winchester sight from the window of the cabin, the lever cold under his hand. 4 men, bounty, outfit out of Cheyenne, the kind who tracked a paper until it paid or until the trail went cold, and this trail hadn't gone cold. They had ascent from the rail camp, and they had ridden it across 3 territories, and they weren't going to stop at a woman in a doorway. He knew that the way he knew the weight of his own gun, because he had been those men. The valley gave him one advantage, and he meant to keep it. A single way in, the cut between the ridges, and after that the ground opened, and a man on foot was a dead man, and a man on horseback was a target. He set the Winchester at the window to hold the open ground and the Colt on the table within reach, and he told her to stay behind the inner wall, and she didn't do it. She moved to the door with the naginata across her body and took the one angle a revolver couldn't cover, the close corner beside the frame where a man inside the cabin was safe from a rifle and dead to a blade, 2 weapons and 2 ranges covering the blind spot, the other left open, and the geometry was so plain he didn't waste breath arguing. The first shot was his, and it was long, and it was meant to be. He put it across the lead rider's front at a distance that a sharpsman would have respected, and the horse swerved, and the column broke, and the men went to ground at the edge of the open ground where the rifle could reach them, and the cabin couldn't be rushed. It was the battle, the way battles start, not with a killing, but with a line drawn and a question asked of the other side, "What are you willing to pay to cross this ground?" The real try was the door. One of them broke from the creek and ran for the frame, while the other 2 put fire on the window to keep Nash's head down, and the runner made the threshold with his revolver up and his eyes on the room, and he never saw the blade. The naginata came out of the door shadow in a long, low arc that took his legs out from under him and put him on the ground with the revolver skidding into the dirt, and the man who had been so sure of the close corner learned in the last second of his life why a woman trained in the old ways kept a polearm by the door instead of a gun. Nash took a second ball in the side high and through the muscle, a piece of lead that punched the wall behind him and left a hole in the timber the size of a man's thumb. The cabin wall was holed and the door was splintered, and one rider, the last one, was up and running for the canyon mouth before Nash could lever another round, and the rider made the cut and was gone into the country south of the Snake. The yard held 3 horses and 2 men who wouldn't get up, and one who wouldn't get up for long. Nash sat against the inner wall with his hand pressed to his side and the blood coming through his fingers, and the victory sat in his mouth like dust, because the man who got away would tell what he had seen, and what he had seen was a cabin worth sending more men to. Our hunters weren't here yet, but they would hear about this, and they would come, and the fight he had just won had bought them a few days and spent the last of his strength to do it. She knelt beside him and lifted his hand away from the side and looked at the wound, the way she had looked at the arm, by the lay of the muscle and the color of the blood, and her face didn't change. She didn't say he was brave. She didn't say thank you. She tore another strip of cloth and pressed it to the hole and told him to hold it, and he held it, and outside the sun moved past the middle of the sky, and the escape rider put another ridge between himself and the valley on his way to carry the news. They come at dawn. 2 days later, the way her family's killers came, and she knows the sound of that approach before he sees it. Fewer men, but harder men, sent across the water to finish a house and its last daughter, and they don't ride the skyline, but come through the creek bed in the gray light with their weapons already in their hands, and the woman at the door goes still in a way Nash hasn't seen her go still before. The kind of still that isn't calm, but the thing that comes just before calm, the body remembering what the mind has tried to forget. The door is the only fight that matters now. He sets the Winchester at the window where it held the ground before, the lever slower in his hands, because the side wound has taken the snap out of him, and he knows the count of rounds in the magazine the way he knows the count of his own breath, and both are running low. She stands at the threshold with the naginata across her body and the blade bare, and the two of them hold the same door from two angles, and neither speaks, because there's nothing left to say that the door doesn't already know. The first man to reach the open ground falls to the Winchester, and the second goes to ground and tries the flank, and the third comes straight for the door while the rifle is busy. The third man makes the threshold with a short sword in his hand, and the naginata takes the distance the revolver gave up, the long blade holding him at the end of its reach where a gun is useless and a blade is law, and he goes down in the doorway learning why a polearm was built to hold a man at the length of its edge. Nash's rifle runs dry. He hears the empty click of the lever on a spent magazine, and a man is already through the yard with a revolver up, and there's no time to reload and no time to think. He brings the Colt up from the table and puts 2 rounds into the runner at a distance he shouldn't have made the shots at, and the runner folds, and the yard is quiet, and the quiet is worse than the noise, because the quiet means it's over and the cost is about to be counted. The third wound is the one that puts him down. A ball from a gun he never saw takes him low in the chest as the last man falls, and the impact lays him on his back on the cabin floor with the Colt still in his hand and the ceiling turning above him in a slow gray circle. The weight goes out of his legs first, and then the arms, and then the world narrows to the sound of the door and the shape of the woman crossing the room toward him. She drags him back from the threshold and drops the bar across the door, and then she's on her knees beside him with the lacquered box open and the needles out and her hands moving with the same slow patience they had the first night, only faster now, because the wound is worse and the time is shorter. The medicine that saved his arm has to save his life, and the protector has become the protected, and the reversal is so complete he would laugh if he had the breath for it. He watches her face from the floor, and it's the same face it has been since the doorway, all sharp angles and dark eyes that don't ask anything of him. No fear in it now either, only the concentration of a woman doing the one thing she knows how to do against a clock that won't wait. The needles go in, cloth goes on, the bottles come open, and she works the way a man sets a trap, and he lies still and lets her, because for the first time in 10 years there's nothing left for his hands to do, and the only thing keeping him alive is the hands of a stranger who isn't a stranger anymore. The cabin is wrecked. The garden is torn where the horses went through. 2 bodies lie in the yard beside the 2 from the first fight, and the door is splintered and the wall is holed and the stove has gone cold. The territory will talk about this door for years, but inside it there's only a woman stitching a man shut and a man letting her, and the sound of it's the quietest sound either of them has earned. A supply rider found the cabin a week later, the kind of man who ran dry goods to the outlying ranches and knew the back valleys the way a preacher knows sins. He saw the yard first, and the bodies, and the splintered door, and he carried the tale to the nearest town before he did anything else, because a story like that one loses heat every mile you wait to tell it. By the time the sheriff rode out, the cabin was clean and the dead were buried, and the woman was sitting on the step with a man beside her who was breathing, and the name on the wanted paper was the name on the man, and the paper didn't know what to do with him anymore. That was what he did that day. He chose a stranger over his own escape, and the frontier, which understood nothing so well as a man who stays when he could ride, couldn't stop repeating it. The name Nash had meant death in 3 territories for 10 years, and at one door in an unmarked valley it came to mean something else, and the territory didn't have a word for the something else, so it told the story instead, the way places do when the fact is bigger than the language they own. The through line of it isn't the fight. The fight was only the cost. The through line is the choice, and the choice is the thing you carry out of the valley. That honor isn't a country and not a code written on a wall. It's a door you refuse to walk away from when the riding would be easier and the staying will cost you everything you have left to spend. 2 people, raised by different ways of standing alone, looked at each other across a table and saw the same thing, and neither of them had to give up their code to do it. And that's the whole of it. He may have lived, he may not have. The point was never the ending. The point was the morning he unsaddled the horse and let the girth ring against the post, and the woman in the doorway nodded once, and the open door was an answer in a language neither of them had to learn. He was a killer. Staying didn't unmake that, and you're left to wrestle with whether one right act can carry the weight of a decade of wrong ones, because settling it would be a kinder lie than the truth deserves. The final image is this. A naginata leans against a cabin wall beside a Winchester rifle, 2 weapons from 2 worlds, resting together the way their owners rest together, and a woman kneels beside a man who is breathing, and the valley is quiet, and the territory is already turning the story into something a stranger will tell a stranger 100 miles from here. The door is closed, the door is still standing, and the question of what you would have done at that threshold is the only thing the story leaves you, which is the only thing a story like this has any right to give. Drop a comment with your city. I want to see how far this story travels.